Hello and welcome to the Political Dispatch, the podcast that explores the now in context. My name is Tom Spare.
I'm Lily Mott.
And I'm Sid Kurapati. In today's episode, we're focusing on one of the world's most enduring and contentious conflicts, the history of Israel and Palestine.
When we started planning today's episode at the beginning of October, a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas was announced. IDF forces continue to target Palestinian and Hamas targets, breaking ceasefire conditions, as does Hamas. The road ahead is uncertain, but we wanted to take a look at the agreement that is being settled between Israel, Palestine, and the governments around the world.
And then, in true Political Dispatch fashion, we want to take a step back from those proposals and take a more historiographical point of view, looking at the forming of a Jewish state and the dismantling of a Palestinian nation.
So to start, Lily, could you give us an overview of the current context?
Absolutely. So, we're going to talk a little bit about where things stand between Israel and Palestine and how fragile peace is. I wouldn't necessarily call it peace yet, but I'm going to give a little bit of a rundown of where we're at and then looking into the future, what needs to happen towards the end of the episode. As of October 2025, when we are recording this, today when we're recording it is October 1st. And this is really important because this situation is changing very quickly. So I just want to make that note at the top. A ceasefire between Israel and Palestine went into effect on October 10th, following 2 years of intense conflict. While neither side has fully upheld every term, both have made limited progress. Israel, for example, has released Palestinian bodies and some prisoners. Hamas, similarly, has returned some Israeli hostages. But the ceasefire is deeply fragile. There have already been accusations from both sides of violations. Israel claims Hamas fired upon Israeli troops in Rafah. Hamas says Israel struck civilian areas and delayed opening crossings. In fact, Gaza's media office states that since the ceasefire's start, Israel has violated it dozens of times, reporting 47 alleged violations and 38 Palestinians killed. That tension over violations shows just how delicate this deal is. So let's move on to the peace deal and its current status and what's still in flux. As I mentioned, this is all changing very quickly, so I'm going to give an overview of the situation. The heart of the peace plan currently under negotiation is Donald Trump's 20-point Gaza peace plan, which includes temporary governance structures, demilitarization of Gaza, rehabilitation of infrastructure, which includes water, power, hospitals, and an international stabilization force, which I'm going to call ISF, to oversee transitions. In this framework, Gaza would be governed by a technocratic, apolitical Palestinian committee under oversight by a new body called the Board of Peace, led by Trump and including Tony Blair, who we're going to talk about a little bit more. Hamas would be excluded from direct governance under this plan. The plan also calls for Israel to gradually withdraw its forces in stages, and there will be benchmarks for demilitarization and reconstruction. However, pushback for this plan is already strong. Some Palestinian leaders and rights groups reject Blair's role in this, citing his past and colonial overtones. Critics also argue that the plan is light on accountability and gives Israel excessive leeway to act unilaterally during the transition. A key dimension of the peace deal is the ceasefire and prisoner hostage exchange, which has been going on for the last few days. Under earlier deals, especially during the January 2025 truce, the framework involved phased exchanges. Israel would release Palestinian prisoners in stages in return for Hamas returning hostages, including bodies. And Israel would withdraw from population centers where aid flows increased. That January deal also included Israel's withdrawal from the Netzarim corridor. In the most recent ceasefire, Hamas has released living Israeli hostages, and Israel has returned the bodies of Palestinians who died during conflict. Yet significant contention remains over the remaining bodies and hostages. Some are missing or buried under the rubble, and Hamas has cited difficulty in retrieving them. Another friction point is that Israel is keeping the Rafah border closed until Hamas returns all bodies. Hamas sees this as a violation. Also, civilian crossings and humanitarian aid are heavily constrained. Food flows remain well below target levels in that area. So, if we think bigger, what is the peace dividend? If this deal holds, what economic and social benefits might it bring? A successful peace agreement would unlock massive reconstruction in Gaza, rebuilding infrastructure, again, electricity, water, sewage, hospitals, clearing rubble, restoring transportation, and enabling private sector revival. Those infrastructure investments can create jobs and stabilize basic services, things that have been devastated by years of war. Peace would mean fewer deaths, greater mobility for Palestinians, and a potential reduction in radicalization that thrives in environments of trauma and economic stagnation. It could also build trust internally among Palestinians and between Israel and Palestinian communities if the transition is handled transparently. Normalizing trade, restoring crossings, and renewed international investment could help close the humanitarian gap. But this depends strongly on credible institutions, access, rule of law, and fair governance. So that leads to the Gaza plan in more detail and a bit about how this plan invokes lessons from earlier peace efforts, which we're going to be talking about a little bit more in this episode. Trump's plan leans heavily on earlier Gaza or Middle East frameworks, particularly ones connected to Tony Blair's work as quartet representative. Some of the same infrastructure blueprints appear in both the older proposals and the 2025 plan. The governance model echoes Blair's prior approach, technocratic management, not political rule. The establishment of the International Stabilization Force, ISF, as I mentioned, is crucial. It's intended to provide security, supervise disarmament, train a civilian police force, and act as a buffer while power transfers. But critics warn Blair's involvement stirs historical memories of colonialism and intervention. His legacy in the Middle East, especially his role in the Iraq War, prompts deep distrust among Palestinians. Others argue that borrowing from Blair's Northern Ireland model is dangerous. It oversimplifies unique Palestinian realities and glosses over the power asymmetry, which, again, we're going to be talking about a little bit more. Then there is that risk that disarmament demands may be unrealistic if Hamas retains underground capabilities or aligned militias refuse to fully cede power. If Israel delays withdrawals or keeps tight security control, legitimacy may erode. So, with all of that, that was kind of laying the groundwork for the rest of our conversation in this episode. And it gives us that broad sweep look from context to ceasefire, from the promise of peace to the bold but highly contested proposals. So I'll pass it over to you, Tom, now.
Lily has provided us with the now, the recent, and I want to delve deeper into the modern history of Palestine, Israel, and the foundation of a Jewish state, and the debate about the recognition of Palestine, I think, is probably another matter entirely. I haven't really covered that in this piece. There's a sort of inconsistent history about arguments about whether a Palestinian state ever existed. And this is something which Israel goes back to frequently, but it'll make more sense as we go through. Just as a bit of a disclaimer, my sources are desktop research. I'm not a scholar of history, and I appreciate that talking about Palestine and Israel can evoke a lot of feeling, opinion, and debate. But I want to approach this section of the podcast through a different frame to the prevailing media narrative, particularly the narrative that started at the beginning when Hamas attacked Israel on the 7th of October. The narrative sort of centers around Israel's incursion into Palestine as a reaction to October the 7th, and that, you know, the destruction of Hamas is sort of essential for there to be peace in the region. And the implication of questioning that can sometimes lead to questions of being accused of anti-Semitism. But that view conveniently ignores the longer, more nuanced history, which I intend to cover in this section. So, first of all, looking at Herzl and the birth of political Zionism. So, I don't want to go back as far as the ancient times or to the Old Testament or further back still. Instead, I want to start with the publication of a book in 1897 by the journalist and lawyer Theodor Herzl entitled The Jewish State. Herzl is considered by many as the founding father of Zionism. Zionism is the theory, belief, and political movement that Jews should have a homeland. That homeland should be a state called Israel. It should be situated in the Levant, a sub-region of West Asia along the Eastern Mediterranean, as written in scripture and holy texts. The term Zionism comes from Zion, which is repeated throughout the Old Testament, the Bible, and many religious texts with several meanings. It's the hill of the city of St. David, which built upon. It's a sort of poetic name for Jerusalem, and later it's a sort of name for the state of Israel. And then there's also various translations in Hebrew meaning to different options as well. Herzl wrote the book as a response to historic anti-Semitism and the contemporary hatred and mistreatment of Jews in Europe and America and elsewhere. Jewish communities were scattered around the globe, stateless and in many ways disparate denominations in a much larger umbrella religion, more akin to the sort of main branches of Christianity. Initially, when I was going to make this comparison, I was going to say about Catholics, but Catholics have their own state in the Vatican, so not as good a comparison. But the branches of Christianity, if you think about the Anglicans, the Baptists, the Methodists, and so on, these are sort of different divisions within a wider religion. There was no unitary state in which they could coalesce, form a polity, and govern themselves. In the book, Herzl powerfully articulates the desperate situation, writing, "No one can deny the gravity of the situation of the Jews. Wherever they live in perceptible numbers, they are more or less persecuted. Everything tends, in fact, to one and the same conclusion, which is clearly enunciated in that classic Berlin phrase, Juden raus, out with the Jews." I shall now put the question in the briefest possible form. Are we to get out now, and where to? Or may we yet remain, and how long? Herzl's work became the foundational text that the Zionist movement and its allies around the world have used to justify and create an Israeli state. This was achieved on May the 14th, 1948. I cannot think of any other text that has singularly led within little over 50 years to the creation of a country. However, Herzl's private writings reveal more of a different intention, perhaps, than many of what the book presents regarding the existing inhabitants of the chosen land. And this is something that continually crops up in the history, is that in his diary, written I think in 1895, he said, "We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries while denying it employment in our own country. The property owners will come over to our side. Both the process of exploration and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumvently." Herzl is referring to the non-Jewish population of the Levant, so the Arab population, Christians, and so on. And this is actually a line which the more extreme parts of Netanyahu's government will often refer to. So they often refer to that sort of same narrative. In March 1899, Herzl received correspondence from Yusuf al-Khalidi, the mayor of Jerusalem, a worldly Ottoman official and prominent Palestinian figure. This exchange is captured in al-Khalidi's great-great-nephew's book, so Rashid Khalidi's book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine. Khalidi compares the establishment of Israel with the white settler population seen across the British and other European empires of the 18th and 19th centuries. And Lily, that sort of links back to what you were saying, that the new peace plan is seen as a colonial project. It's sort of a continuation from that part. Al-Khalidi's letter opened with respect for Herzl. And so even though these two people I don't think they ever met, they sort of will have known of one another. And al-Khalidi reached out to Herzl via the French authorities, and acknowledging the historical connection of the Jews to Palestine, stating that Zionism in principle was a natural, beautiful and just, and who could contest the rights of the Jews in Palestine? My God, historically, it is your country. Now, at the time that they were writing, the Arab population far outnumbered the Jewish population by a huge significant margin. And the Arab population was quite disparate in the sense that it was very mixed. It was people from everywhere because it was a sort of conduit from the Mediterranean from the Western world into the Eastern world. Lots of trade going on, so there's lots of people passing through, and lots of denominations of religions, different of aspects or different parts of the Jewish faith, different parts of Christianity, different parts of Islam. Al-Khalidi immediately pivots to a stern warning. His main argument centered on the brutal force of circumstances, namely that Palestine was an integral part of, at this time, the Ottoman Empire, and more gravely, it's inhabited by others. He asserted that the indigenous population would never accept being superseded and concluded with a heartfelt plea, in the name of God, let Palestine be left alone. And again, this echoes to what we are seeing now and what's playing out now. He suggested the unhappy Jewish nation should find a refuge elsewhere, which is sort of easier said than done, particularly if your population and your brethren are being persecuted around the world. Herzl's reply was sent quickly on the 19th of March and is characterized as a sort of pattern of dismissing the insignificant interests of the indigenous population. And this is, again, something that's constantly repeated, that the views of the Arabs, of Muslims, and now, as we see in Palestinian population and not being part of the peace plan directly, are being ignored. So the core objection is that Palestine was already inhabited and instead employed a sort of colonialist justification that the Jewish immigration would benefit the indigenous population. And this is what we saw in the French Empire, in the British Empire, and other empires, the European empires. It is their well-being, their individual wealth, which will increase by bringing in our own. And this is a similar thing that Donald Trump's been echoing and other people in his administration. Herzl's letter addressed the non-Jewish population difficulty Al-Qaeda hadn't explicitly raised by asking, you see, another difficulty, Excellency, is in the existence of the non-Jewish population in Palestine. But who would think of sending them away? But that's a contrast to his diary entry a year earlier and his sort of future documents, including the 1901 draft charter for the Jewish Ottoman Land Company, which included the explicit removal of the inhabitants of Palestine to other territories of the Ottoman Empire. And again, this is, there's so many things that are repeated here over time. And Donald Trump has repeatedly said, well, can't the Palestinians go elsewhere? Can't they go to other regions? So this section concludes that Al-Khalidi understood that the Zionist goal was the transformation of the entire land into a Jewish state, not into a place where both Jews and Arabs could live alongside one another. Rashid Khalidi also suggests that his great-great-uncle was left with the conclusion that Herzl either intended to deceive him or simply did not see Yusuf al-Khalidi and the Arabs of Palestine as worthy of being taken seriously. So, the Ottoman Empire and British promises. At the time of this letter exchange, Palestine was part of a much larger Ottoman Empire. As academic professor Jonathan Schneer argues, the Ottoman Empire played a foundational role in shaping modern-day Palestine, primarily for its long-standing control of the territory, which, when occupied with its eventual defeat in World War I, created the vacuum that allowed British wartime promises to Arabs and Zionists to take effect. For Zionists seeking an establishment of a Jewish homeland, the Ottoman Empire was their greatest obstacle. Zionist efforts dating back to 1897 failed to persuade the Turks to allow unrestricted Jewish immigration. This meant the Zionist strategy relied entirely on the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, viewing it as an opportunity for the Turks to be expelled and a British protectorate to be established, opening the territory to massive Jewish immigration. When the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany in World War I, Britain was forced to court both Arab and Zionist support, leading to the contradictory promises that defined the region's future. And my first introduction to this, which was not really a very accurate depiction, but equally sort of Hollywood depiction, was Lawrence of Arabia. So in Lawrence of Arabia, there's Lawrence, who is British military man who comes in and sort of unites the various tribes to defeat the Ottomans. And he's constantly going on, because the film goes on for about 4 days. It's a very long film. And he's constantly talking about getting to Aqaba, and eventually they get to Aqaba. And so, but excellent film, very problematic in the current context. You have Sir Alec Guinness, which is definitely very English, dressing up as an Arab. Not great, but very good cinematography, and has inspired a lot of films. Since the Arab Rebellion of 1916, so the British encouraged and supported the Grand Sharif Hussein of Mecca to rebel against the Ottomans, promising an independent Arab kingdom via the Makanan-Hussein correspondence. And the other part was what's now become, if anyone ever says to you, I don't think Britain has any part to play in all of this, just say the Balfour Declaration and walk out the room and just look at the Balfour Declaration, because it's basically the document, the agreement, which sets out the sort of the national home for the Jewish people of Palestine. Without mentioning Palestinians, we've got another continuous theme here where the Palestinians are ignored from the process. So the 1917 Balfour Declaration, Balfour was a member of the British cabinet and made promises which the British couldn't keep. The defeat on the Ottoman Empire was the precondition for the British to implement their conflicting promises, which laid the groundwork for the modern-day Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Yeah, so in Professor Rashid Khalidi's book, who was a student of and became a colleague of Edward Said, who's also another very famous Palestinian author and academic who wrote Orientalism, which we studied when we were doing our MA. He wrote also The Question of Palestine, various other books. Rashid Khalidi is very well thought of. He was teaching at Columbia University until October 2024, and then he resigned after threats by the sort of potential future at that point, Trump administration and its role in sort of targeting universities. So he argues that there were 6 turning points or 6 wars against Palestine that have shaped modern day Palestine and Israel. And we'll examine these through the lens of Edward Said's critique of sort of seeing Israel as a sort of colonial project. So the first declaration of war was basically 1917 to 1939. So this period begins with the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and Khalidi views as the declaration of war by the British Empire on the indigenous population. So there was the great 1936 to 1939 Arab Revolt, which involved as many as 50,000 soldiers. And actually, in terms of military and civilian personnel, was probably somewhere in the line of 100,000 colonial forces were involved in the conflict, in the revolt, which confirmed the British colonial suppression of the indigenous population. And during that time, the British authorities were helping train up Zionists. So the idea that, for example, to basically eventually lead a Jewish state. And this is part of the problem with the peace plan and the proposals that sort of technocratic plan that's been put forward by Tony Blair and others, is it doesn't involve the Palestinians from day one, and it has to. Whereas the British, when they were being involved in the creation of the Jewish state, involved Jewish folks from the start. So there's a contrast there in how they're approaching these two things. They're sort of, or I would argue, setting them up for failure, just in the same way that once colonial forces left Kenya and South Africa and all other parts of the world, basically setting these places up to failure, because in many ways you want them to fail, because their success would mean that you failed in ruling them in the first place. The second declaration of war was the 1947 to 1948. The turning point sort of centres on what's called the Nakba, the catastrophe, which Said identifies as the central traumatic national encounter with Zionism. So when I went to Washington, D.C., the day after the election last year, I went to the Palestinian Museum, or the Museum of Palestinian People in Washington, D.C., and the director showed me around. It was like a room with basically sort of 3,000 years of history within it. It's quite incredible. And one of the symbols of Palestine has become a key, and that is related to folks who were kicked out of their homes, and they took their keys with them with the belief, but actually with reassurances from the authorities that they would return home. And many of them, including Edward Said's family, were never able to return home. They were never able to go back to their homes. They were occupied and taken over because of the creation of the Jewish state. The passage of the UN General Assembly Resolution 181 on November the 29th, 1947, which partitioned Palestine was considered another declaration of war. This resolution provided the international birth certificate for the Jewish state, and that was passed with the decisive support of the United States, which would become a theme as we carry on through this time, whose president, Harry Truman, had already made Zionist statehood part and parcel of the emerging American hegemony. So the Second World War signifies the transfer of colonialism of old, of the sort of 18th and 19th centuries, to the colonialism of the 20th century and the 21st century, which is the American empire, which people would refer to it as the dominant force of America. And so from this point onwards, the British lose quite a lot of influence in the region, and it's then supplemented and taken over by the United States. Yeah, so the war culminated in the expulsion of over half of the Arab population, allowing Israel to control 78% of the former mandatory territory, which was run by the British between it taking over the Ottomans and handing over to the UN. And bearing in mind, for a year or so, Palestine was looked after by the UN, which was a very new body, didn't really have any experience of this at all. And so it's actually one of the first UN failures was this situation. And then you have the third declaration of war, which was the 6-Day War, which resulted in Israel conquering the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and the subsequent UN Security Council resolutions 242 is a perfect example of the Western liberal Zionist hegemony, which Said describes as sort of the United States providing sort of diplomatic cover for Israel's refusal to withdraw unconditionally, and ensured the resolution omitted any mention of Palestinians by name. Again, not mentioning Palestinians, treating them only as a refugee problem. And this is where it really starts, is that it then becomes an issue of where do we put these folks? Well, they can't be in Israel. They have to be somewhere else. And this has become the continued thing, even though, as I mentioned, there were still people with their house keys that wanted to go home. So that's just an image to keep with you. Then you have the fourth declaration of Israel's invasion of Lebanon, aiming to defeat the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, which eventually faded away and was replaced by Hamas in Palestine and then Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're sort of the ancestral partners. You have the fifth declaration of war. This era begins with the first Intifada between 1987 and 1993 and the subsequent Oslo Accords. So many people will probably, when they flash through on the news, where they give a segment of like 2 minutes to Palestine and Israel, they'll have Bill Clinton shaking hands with a number of folks outside the White House in sort of the early 90s, and that was the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords, sponsored by the United States, were intended to move towards statehood, but instead preserved the core occupation. So this aligns with Said's critique of the sort of exclusionary system. The US failed to act as an honest broker, leading American negotiators to describe their stance as Israel's lawyer. And the Oslo framework effectively enlisted the new Palestinian Authority as a subcontractor for occupation, thus denying true self-determination. And Edward Said, who, brilliant academic, was heavily involved and then left after the Oslo Accords because he just saw it as futile, basically. And you had like folks like Yasser Arafat, for example, who for a very long time was a sort of rebel leader who then became to epitomize the nation of Palestine and seen as sort of Palestine's last hope. And when he died, a lot of that hope faded with him. And then you have the sixth declaration of war between 2000 and 2014 with sort of another attempted uprising in 2000. The period saw a surge in violence, which led to full-blown siege of the Gaza Strip by the Israelis. The United States provided massive and continuous military and financial support, loans and arms, which sustained the colonial status quo of military occupation and expanded Jewish settlements, particularly in the West Bank. And so again, as you've mentioned, Lily, lots of criticisms of how this has been handled, all legitimized by the United States. And between the two most recent presidents, I would argue, has probably seen the most radical reaction by Israel and the state of Israel in the expulsion of Palestinians from their homeland. So Biden in funding Israel, providing more weapons, always turning down any opportunity for a ceasefire in the UN. And then Trump in his first presidency recognizing as I'll say actually. So 2014 to 2023 saw the collapse of a two-state framework. And Trump in 2019 recognized Israel's sovereignty of the Golan Heights, and also paved the way for Israeli annexation of the West Bank, which is sort of another part of Palestine. The same period saw the emergence of the Abraham Accords, where Arab nations normalized diplomatic relations with Israel. And this move bypassed the requirement to resolve the Palestinian issue first, further isolating the Palestinians. And that was led by Jared Kushner, so Donald Trump's son-in-law, who again has played a pivotal role in the peace negotiations. And just sort of to finally sort of conclude this part, amid the political hardening, the violence escalated, with 2022 becoming, before the Israeli incursion into Palestine and the subsequent genocide, the deadliest year for both sides since 2005. And despite this volatility, Israeli military and intelligence officials harbored a single, fatally inaccurate belief that Hamas lacked the capability and the intent to launch a major attack. So there was an article that was published in the New York Times, which has been criticized for not being critical enough of Israel and its actions in Gaza, and a blueprint for the attack, codenamed Jericho Wall, circulated widely for more than a year. Just 3 months before the attack, a veteran intelligence analyst warned that Hamas training exercises matched the blueprint exactly, writing in an email, "It's a plan designed to start a war. It's not just a raid on a village." This warning was brushed off by a colonel in the Gaza division as totally imaginative scenario. This fatal complacency was compounded by severe internal political crisis in Israel. From January to October 2023, massive weekly protests took place across Israel against Benjamin Netanyahu's judicial sort of overhaul. So he was trying to undermine the power of the judiciary and independence of the Supreme Court. Intelligence officials warned that this internal disunity was being perceived by Israel's enemies as a weakening of a deterrent and an opportunity for aggression. And a lot of Israeli forces were actually in the West Bank trying to manage tensions that were breaking out between Israelis and Palestinians. And thus, as Israel was internally consumed by a domestic crisis and military complacency, under a false sense of security regarding Gaza, the long history of the colonial conflict was poised to enter its most catastrophic phase yet, with the October 7th sort of catastrophe and subsequent military operations by Israel. So that, in summary, is 130 years of history in about 15 minutes.
That was absolutely fantastic, Tom. And I hope our listeners get a very detailed understanding of how systematic this whole process has been, who are the players involved, and all the decisions, all the wars, all the external interventions that have led us to today.
If you're interested in reading more about the topics we discussed, I'd encourage you to read The 100 Years' War, and we'll link that in the description of this episode.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of The Political Dispatch. Tune in for our next episode, which will be a continuation of these lessons in conflict and peace.
In our next episode, the second half of the series, we will examine two very distinct conflicts, one in Ireland and the other between India and Pakistan, one which achieved peace while the other having a lasting impact of partition.
You can find us wherever you found this episode. Please like, subscribe, and share our show so we can continue to reach more people and drive up interest in these vital conversations. My name is Tom Spare.
I'm Lily Budd.
And I'm Sid Kurapati. You've been listening to The Political Dispatch.